Good morning and welcome to today's session where we look at the future of legal practice and climate change. I'm Bal, LawTech Lab Manager over at the Barclays Eagle Labs. A quick disclaimer from myself. The topics discuss an overview of options for you to think about to help you with your independent research and business decisions, so aren't intended as recommendations or advice. Remember that your business has its own individual circumstances. The statements and views expressed may not be applicable or suitable for you and your business. Thank you. Andrew, over to you to intro the panel.
Thank you very much, Bill. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our Barclays Eagle Lab and Law Society Future of Webinar series. Today, I'm very pleased to have an expert panel with us to discuss the future of your legal profession and climate change. I'm joined by Carolyn May, Head of Sustainability at Northern Rose Fulbright, Anna Marie Slott, Partner at Ashurst, and Mark Anderson, Legal and Professional Services Sector Leader at PwC. Good morning. Before we plow into questions, panel, would you like to say a little bit more about yourselves individually and your interest and background and professional expertise? Anna Marie?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So I'm Anna Marie Slott, as Andrew mentioned. I'm the Global Sustainability and ESG Partner for Ashurst, practicing in also finance as a background. And so, I come at this really from a kind of a broad brush of industry and global reach, and really bringing together what we're doing across Ashurst and all of our offices and all of our practice groups to see how we can work with clients on the challenges that they're facing around climate change and sustainability more broadly.
Thank you, Anna Marie. Mark?
Thanks, Andrew. Mark Anderson. I'm a partner at PwC. I lead our legal professional services practice. So I work with a lot of law firms and in-house legal teams on transformation type programs, and that clearly leans heavily into the technology and ESG as part of that. I also run a team at PwC that does diligence on suppliers, and we do a range of ESG and anti-corruption and broader regulatory diligence as part of that group.
Thank you, Mark. And Carolyn?
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. I'm Carolyn May. I'm a partner and head of sustainability at Norton Rose Fulbright. I've been a practicing environmental lawyer since long before it was fashionable to be so over 30 years. I also, in my capacity today, I chair the Law Society Working Group on Climate Change, working with Alistair Cameron and others. And I'm also a director of the Legal Sustainability Alliance, which is an NGO comprising the top 100 law firms sharing best practice in the climate change and net zero space. So hopefully I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Caroline. Alistair, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, happy to. Thank you. So I'm today representing the Law Society's perspective on climate change. I lead on climate change policy at the Law Society of England and Wales and support the Climate Change Working Group. Thank you.
Carolyn, do you want to start off with?
Yes, Andrew had asked me to lead off talking about what's new in this area. Hang on, I'm just getting up the questions.
Yeah, so let me just jump in there. So if you could just cover a brief summary of the key issues facing the profession and advice to clients, particularly how climate risk is beginning to affect legal advice and what's new and coming up in terms of regulatory and other.
Thank you. So climate risk, I think COP26 added an impetus and really did raise the consciousness of this issue. So climate risk is now sort of elevated. I've been practicing environmental law for 30 years now. And when we started out, it was really about contaminated land, air pollution, heavy industry causing issues for air, land and water quality. And so we were very much seen as the sort of dirty lawyers helping industry clean up. Obviously, that's moved along now, and there's a whole range of new subject matters and new law. So carbon emission trading, net zero, energy transition are all now key parts of large commercial legal practice, bringing in a whole new generation of young lawyers and new law, lots of evolving, changing law and guidance, the evolution of corporate reporting, particularly for ESG matters, which could of itself be a subject matter for a seminar, but I'll touch on ESG slightly in a moment. But it brings a whole new analysis to legal corporate reporting, legal analysis, and legal risk, quite frankly. So there's a whole new area. So it's not all negative news for lawyers. There's a whole new area that a new generation of lawyers can grow up with and understand. And legal education in this area is something I know which the Law Society is looking at very closely. But what of the risk side, and what for those who aren't operating in the sort of specialist sectors? Well, our newscasts are full every day of extreme weather events. So for high street conveyancers, flood risk is now something that needs to be looked at. The assessment of asset values for buying and selling any sort of asset may well be affected either by extreme weather or by carbon emissions or by the direction of travel of regulatory mandates. So it is something that affects every practitioner, even if you're in a small practice feeling that this whole agenda is for larger specialist firms and lawyers. It's going to affect everybody, the availability of mortgages, the availability of capital for green investment. It's going to affect all areas. So even from the sort of smallest corporates up to the largest, and for individuals buying property or selling property, it's going to be a key consideration. So there's going to be lots of legal risk. There's going to be lots of legal opportunity. But where there is a real need and an emphasis, I think, is for legal understanding and for the role that solicitors can play. We are trusted advisors. We are responders to government consultation, particularly through the Law Society and through other initiatives. I've talked about the working group, and I'll come on to talk about that a little bit more, and also initiatives like Lawyers for Net Zero, the LSA, etc. So there's a lot of energy in this area and a lot of opportunity for lawyers to get involved, but critically for lawyers to educate themselves and understand the risks. So what's new in this area? Well, I talked a little bit about ESG, which is on everybody's lips, environmental social governance. Everybody's talking about ESG. The bit that's missing in the discussion is how ESG should be interpreted and how it affects your business, your daily life. And I think the difference here is everybody, I think, has now got a handle on the environmental regulatory frameworks, but the social governance frameworks are still emerging and still new. The emergence of diversity and inclusion reporting, CSR reporting, has hitherto, I think, been seen as a sort of nice to have add-on, but it's now becoming a fundamental imperative. The ability for directors and officers liability, I know there was some discussion in the press yesterday suggesting the Companies Act should be amended to make all boards responsible for sustainability and for their decision making, to make sure that climate risk and sustainability is at the heart of every business. So there's going to be a lot of issues around corporate reporting. There's going to be new guidance and potentially new law in that area. There's clearly going to be competitive risk. When I'm advising clients, they're obviously concerned for their own business operations, but they're also concerned about what their closest competitors are doing and what their closest competitors are saying in the marketplace. And that applies to lawyers and law firms just as it does to manufacturing or industrial clients. Law firms want to make sure they're keeping up in their immediate sector. There's increasing amounts of shareholder activism, also prompted by the large amount of corporate reporting. And therefore, there are going to be challenges, public law, judicial reviews, and client earth campaigning type law firms holding companies to account for their corporate statements to make sure that they're not guilty of greenwashing. And there's been recent press commentary about some of the larger law firms as well, and statements being made to hold corporates to account for what they do. And so that you're going to see a great deal more accountability in this area and allegations of greenwashing. There's certainly a growth in that kind of collective litigation in the United States at the moment. And I think we will see that coming into the UK and Europe much more prominently than it has to date. So there are lots of new areas, new risks and new liabilities, but also new opportunities. And lawyers need to make sure that they are understanding. You don't have to be a specialist in the area, but you need to know those who are, and you need to know other specialists that you might need and want to draw upon, that environmental consultants, ESG consultants, who can help you and your clients assess the risks for your business. And in response to that, the Law Society is in the process of creating a climate change hub and providing guidance for solicitors as to what they should do. The Law Society issued its climate change resolution in the run-up to COP, which was largely the work product of Alistair and others who worked tirelessly on it, giving direction and leadership for the profession, saying that lawyers had a key role to play in many areas in moving the agenda on, understanding the risks and advising the clients, and also in running their own businesses sustainably. And for those of you who haven't seen the climate change resolution, I would urge you to go to the Law Society website and look at that. The Climate Change Working Group, which I chair at the Law Society, which is put together by representative members of the profession, is looking at working on issuing detailed guidance to solicitors about how they can enact and work in their daily lives in response to that resolution, and looking at some of the ethical questions around the SRA principles and whether and how they need to be interpreted in the light of the climate change emergency and agenda. So there's a lot of work to do, and we would hope that that guidance will be ready in the latter part of this year, and will provide some real sort of nitty-gritty guidance to solicitors in the profession about what they need to be doing and what they need to be aware of. There's also been some criticism of lawyers as professional enablers. When isn't there any criticism of lawyers, of course? But there has been increasing amounts of commentary about that, and that gives rise to some interesting ethical questions, which is what our group has been considering in the light of the SRA principles. But I think what is clear from this is it's something that cannot be ignored, and that whether you think you're working in the high street or whether you're working in a larger practice, it's an agenda that you need to be aware of, and more importantly, you need to know where you can go to seek help. And I mentioned at the beginning, obviously, the work the Law Society is doing in putting its hub together. Also, other bodies like the Legal Sector Alliance, Best Practice, the Chancery Lane Project, which is an innovative volunteering group which offers specimen wordings on the climate change agenda to the market. And I'd urge you to look at those wordings on their website, and other organisations like Lawyers for Net Zero and the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. So there's a lot of help and information out there, and I would encourage everybody to at least be aware of where they can get help and guidance and where to look, because that's the key to beginning that debate. Alistair, I'll pass to you to see if there's anything else you would like to add.
No, not much more that I can add to that, Caroline. You did an excellent job of giving the overview of the key issues there. Yes, I would say that as our climate change resolution that I'll put in the chat shortly, the main thing I'd say is to educate yourself and others on this. So thinking about how climate change impacts your specific practice area. And then secondly, as well, thinking about how you can mainstream climate change considerations throughout your legal practice, so the practice of law itself, but also the way that you run your business. And the Legal Sustainability Alliance, they have fantastic resources there, and thinking about whether you can set a net zero strategy for your firm. And then thirdly, as well, if not engaging in activism, can you be active? And how can you be active in this space as a solicitor? Because I think that solicitors are professionally empowered to take action on climate change, just as individuals are, and have the scope to make quite an impact in this area as trusted advisors, as Caroline said. Thank you.
Thank you. I came in the end, Carolyn, of your, it sounded like a great summary of where we're at and what the legal profession is up to at the moment in helping move, I guess, from more traditional legal practices to a more strategic take on climate change and its effects. And Alistair, as he says, we'll put the link into the Law Society's resolution, climate change resolution. We'll also provide the links for Lawyers for Net Zero and the Legal Sustainability Alliance and the Chancery Lane Project before we close today. If I can move us on, and apologies in advance if I'm repeating anything you've already covered, but let's move us on. And I'd like to come to Anna Marie next with the next question. I'm just wondering, Anna Marie, that we wake up every morning to awful news from Ukraine, obviously, and we think as well of the suffering of the people there, but also about how attitudes may change in terms of the legal profession and accepting clients. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the possible implications for climate change in the profession.
Yeah, no, look, it is an interesting time to be alive, certainly. And we do have more and more this kind of wider view of what companies should do, what law firms should do, what all organizations could be doing, what role they play in society, right? And so you see that also in the legal profession. We're certainly not early adopters of most things. I think if you know many lawyers, they're not necessarily the front of the pack when it comes to rethinking how to do things. But it is emerging. You know, all of these topics that come up through ESG, as Carolyn mentioned, you know, everything from the historic of climate and environmental on its most basic level, what are you doing to that piece of land in your transaction, to now D&I, and how does that, what does that mean from a talent perspective? What does that mean in your organization? All the way through to, you know, conversation about purpose and things like that. Law firms are not immune to that. And what it is to be part of your law firm and what your law firm is part of that larger ecosystem is becoming more and more of an open question. So what we're seeing happen is, you know, law firms have always dealt with various situations, right? Before climate, there was, you know, a very distinct feeling among various people around, for example, the tobacco industry. Did you want to represent various players in the tobacco industry? Where was your position on asbestos? You know, there are various topics that came through. I think the real change that you're seeing now with how companies are reacting, and law firms in particular reacting to things like what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the environment, is people are moving from that case-by-case basis. What does this mean in light of our practice, to a more holistic framework around what is it that we are prepared to engage with, and where are our positions in that. And I think it's really about kind of this there are just different terms that people use for that: organizational congruence, you know, in intellectual consistency within a structure. But I think that is really becoming something that is a live topic for everyone in law firms, and a valid topic. And questions like the Ukraine is bringing that to the fore and putting that on the top of their agenda to say, you know, who are we as a firm? I think climate change is, you know, fundamentally a key question to that whole analysis. You know, because you are talking about something that we've realized is a transformation of the entire physical built asset base of the world, right? There's no, the world is round. You can't get away from this. There is only one air that we all breathe. And so what firms do in analyzing those risks and working with the clients around those risks is becoming a live topic for all the types of law. So the specialists like Carolyn, you know, Carolyn's been a specialist for a very long time. She knows, you know, what's going on in this, but that is feeding through to all of the other practice groups and all of the other industries. And I think you see that in the legal sector in particular. And what that means, you know, the big law firms have centralized basically lots of what they do. They centralize their risk, they centralize their compliance. I think what it is, where that's causing you know, more work maybe is the mid and the smaller law firms, where historically that's been a practice by practice basis. It's been a partner by partner basis. And I think now you're getting to the point where people are realizing, okay, well, yes, we all have individual practices, but how do those practices look together? And so it's really a kind of a transformation of how legal services have historically been.
And thanks for that, Anna Marie. We're getting quite, well, I don't know if it's well down the road, but we're on the road now in terms of future disclosure and fiduciary duties or requirements for climate change, on climate change. I'm thinking of the case against Shell, the Climate Earth's case against Shell. How do you think that's going to play out? Do you have any?
Yes.
How do you think that's going to move the needle?
Yeah, it's a really interesting use of law, really. You know, so the Client Earth case is essentially in some ways a follow-on from the Dutch case against Shell in 2021. So Client Earth has not filed a case, but they have given Shell a notice of an intention to file a case against the directors. Now, that's Client Earth in its capacity as a shareholder of Shell is stepping in to do a derivative suit against the directors in order to say that the directors have not fulfilled their fiduciary duties in terms of being, in particular, around environment. So are the Shell directors and the energy transition plan that Shell has put forward in keeping with those directors' duties to both the company and also the shareholders of the company? Are they consistent? And so that's, a relatively new use of fiduciary duty arguments. There are a couple cases around the world where in other jurisdictions where courts are being asked to look at that question. But if you look at it since 2015, the number of climate change cases or cases that have an aspect of climate change to them has doubled. So that's a very, very significant growth in a very short period of time. And it is that point of intersection, and I think that point that we'll come up to later in this conversation is that point of what are you saying that you're doing? What are you actually doing? And what does that look like in light of what needs to happen? And that's where that case is trying to go. So Client Earth's intention is to say, Shell, you aren't doing what you need to be doing because your targets are not in actual fact delivering the type of transformation that we need in that energy sector in order to achieve a 1.5 agreement level. And so that I wouldn't be surprised by more of these. Let's just say there are, as Caroline mentioned as well, there are lots and lots of organizations now focused on how do you hold people to account. And it is that aspect of both disclosure and accountability where lawyers always historically and will continue now and into the future to play a critical role in companies responding to those aspects of their daily work. Maybe I can go ahead and ask the next question to Mark, because we are at a place where we have all these risks. I do think we have lots of opportunities also in that, and I think lawyers are particularly well suited to identify those opportunities. Again, we'll get to that a little bit later.
Mark, can I come to you? Would that be okay? So what technology and tools are available now to help companies and LLPs and the lawyers who advise them effectively demonstrate climate-friendly practices, perform due diligence, and meet their reporting obligations? What would help?
Thanks, Bal. Well, I should say, maybe tongue in cheek, certainly the sort of hybrid home working technologies have made a massive difference to all of our working environments and ESG credentials during the pandemic. But maybe I should start with a little bit of a warning, actually, because I think sometimes organizations and lawyers no different, and even ourselves, think about technology as a sort of panacea, if you like. And we did a report last year looking at investing in climate-related technologies, and showed that over $3.5 billion worth of money being invested, just in climate change management and reporting technology. So there is an absolute plethora of tools and technology in the market. And so I think the warning to sort of everyone first is to really think about your own policies, objectives, and outcomes actually around the technology platforms or tools that you want to use, and because really the inputs that you put into that planning process, if you like, are just as important as the sort of platforms and tools that you select. And I'm sure many lawyers on the phone have been inundated with offers of demos and pilots with lots of different platforms. But I think if I probably tackle a few areas. One is, I think, a particular challenge around data to start with, and then I think maybe some of the tools I would probably divide into maybe three areas. One is around reporting, second is around contracting, and third is around supply chain and suppliers. I think if we look at data and technology first, so I think the real challenge, as I said, is actually getting your data organized in order to help actually make the tools that you implement or technologies that you implement more effective. And actually, a lot of our clients go through a process of doing this first before looking at the actual tech platform. So, for example, gathering your own data around things like emissions, around contracts, around diversity inclusion, for example, around sort of gender or ethnicity representation, CSR. There's lots of different areas where, as I said, you're getting your data organized and in a way that will help you use technology is pretty important. And then similarly, I think thinking about the external data sets that you reference or use as either benchmarking or access from some of these platforms. There are some ratings agencies out there that provide data now on some larger enterprises around things like ESG or emissions, your Bloombergs or some of your specialist suppliers like a rep risk, for example, but actually getting data on lower tiers of supply chain and data sets that are really bespoke for your own needs really does require some thought and some planning and strategy around what you want to get out of it. So I think data challenges around internal and external data sets to think about. But if I go into the three areas, like around reporting, I think the key is understanding your baseline initially. Traditionally, obviously, people go to buildings to start with to look at what's my impact around net zero, and then your people. So obviously for law firms and professional services firms, people are a big input into their emissions. Where they're traveling and how they're traveling. How they are using hybrid working enablement platforms, and then actually suppliers. So Scope 3 emissions really focuses most heavily on suppliers, and this is probably the biggest challenge, which I'll come on to. But an example around benchmarking, we recently opened a new building in Belfast in Waterfront Plaza, and actually worked with a third party around the contracting and building of that platform called Sustain IQ. Which helped us actually just assemble all of our data at the start of that project, and then demonstrate the emissions and outputs of the project in a really helpful way. So I guess that's an example of sort of using a platform to help baseline and then benchmark in use of building. I think another key area around reporting is around regulation and regulatory reporting. In addition to regulations, there's also a number of voluntary reporting schemes and initiatives that organisations sign up to, particularly around things like tax. So I think there again, there's a complexity there, and I think it's key to understand how you're linking emissions reporting, tax reporting, financial disclosures, and look to platforms to automate and collate some of that reporting, particularly for different stakeholder groups. And there's a range of again different tools and technologies that you can use to do that. And I would see that evolving significantly over the coming years as that more complex regulatory environment develops, as Caroline was setting out at the beginning. Contracting is a particularly hot area at the moment, and particularly hot area for this sector. And you can break that down into sort of contract discovery platforms like a DCI, for example, where you're actually looking to identify your contract portfolio, look for clauses in there, for example, that relate to ESG, for example, things like suppliers and Scope 3 emissions. What data can you get from your suppliers to enable you to report more easily? And then actually moving more into things like smart contracting, so sort of contract lifecycle management platforms, for example, or efficiency tools like DocuSign or iCertis. A lot of organizations looking at transformation as not only a cost out exercise, but also a carbon out exercise. So I think really understanding your contract portfolio and what data can you gather and pass through from your suppliers, particularly around Scope 3 emission reporting, is really, really important. And I think because of lawyers input into the contracting process, actually they have a big role to play, not only in their own organizations, but actually in what their clients do around contracting and the transformation opportunity that's there. The third area I mentioned is around supply chain. Again, this is a really big one for many organizations. And there's some tools and platforms that break down into things like diligence. So really understanding your supply chain. There's some quite interesting AI tools in the market now that look to map lower tiers of supply chain so that you can properly understand, where and what you're sourcing. We work with an organization called Interos, which does this and also gives you some automated sort of risk mapping and monitoring capability. And then, as I said, risk indexing and models around tracking risk and linking those to supply codes of conduct, for example, is another area where that type of tool can also help. There's a range of platforms to help with supply chain due diligence and auditing. So again, getting things like open source material on suppliers, some of the ratings and benchmarking data and agencies that I mentioned earlier. And I think probably the other area is around procurement platforms that offer you sort of workflow and reporting around supply chain. So a lot of those are now incorporating modules around ESG and third-party risk management. So the likes of Cooper, for example, which is traditionally a performance management platform for suppliers, but now offering that capability in ESG reporting. So those, I think, that for me, the three areas, as I said, with that overlay of caution around, making sure you understand your own data and you understand your objectives and an overall strategy around using tech to further enable your ESG strategy.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very insightful. I'm sure our attendees found that hugely value adding. This is a question for everyone on the panel. I'll start with you, Anne-Marie, first, if that's okay. In-house counsel will have important roles in advising firms on their climate change obligations. What advice does the panel have for them? Anne-Marie, should we start with you?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Paul. Look, I think in-house counsel are critical to this whole process, right? And it is very new on the one hand and not at all new on the other hand, because GC's whole purpose and skill and the value they bring to their organizations is all about understanding risk, understanding materiality for the company. So every single company is going to be going through this. Every company is at a different stage of this, but every company needs to be looking at it now. And what stops people and what's, I think, causes people to kind of put it to the end of the agenda instead of the front of the agenda is understanding what that means for the firm or what that means for that company and understanding that materiality. And that's where a GC, has enormous abilities and skill sets to really bring value to the organization, because they are seeped in understanding this is material, this isn't material, this is a high priority, this is a low priority. It is expanding that understanding to include things like ESG and seeing the world through that lens so that you understand. We have historically always done our budget expecting the exact same weather conditions this year that we had for the last 20. That won't happen. So what does that look like for our company? What does it look like if we flood every 3 years all of our major manufacturing sites as opposed to every 100? What does it look like if I have a hurricane that shuts off operations for 2 weeks each year, right? What does that look like from a materiality perspective, and where are we most exposed? And I think that's where GCs can really come in and shine if they're on the front foot with that. It's about reaching out to the trade organizations that are already out there and who've done a lot of road mapping. You look at whatever industry you're in, the IEA, when it comes to energy, is fantastic in terms of figuring out what does that path look like. UK GBC has done a fantastic amount of work about what does it look like to get the built environment to net zero. So there's lots and lots of organizations out there putting together these roadmaps. And as a GC, as you educate yourself on that, from your own perspective what that means for your company, and you can drive that conversation. So that would be my, they are really an essential part of that. I don't know if Caroline or Mark, if you had additional things that you wanted to add in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah, I would endorse what you've just said. The GC role is the interface, if you like, between the legal and the risk, and then the business and the commercial. And I think in this area, manufacturing clients in particular have been well ahead of the game. If you look at companies like Rolls-Royce, they've been securing their supply chain for about the past 30 years. Similarly, some of the major brewers, for example, looking at wheat growing, which will also be affected by what's happened in Ukraine, they've been looking at securing and where and how they grow and source their raw materials. I think the area that is behind, and I'll risk saying this, is the financial services sector, which is a very big sector in the City of London, because for a long time, financial services felt that this wasn't an area that affected them. They were dealing in equities, loan instruments, was purely lending, and they didn't fully understand the impact of this agenda on their investment decisions, on their lending portfolio. And I think that's where ESG has really driven this into the heart of the financial services sector, and with some of the developments in corporate reporting and data collection, which Mark was just talking about, this is now on the agenda of every board and every bank and every pension fund and every insurance fund, because there's an enormous drive now looking at the money chain and where it goes and how it drives behaviours. And that's been the missing piece in the 30 years I've been doing this kind of work. In the last 2 rounds of popularity, I've only been popular 3 times in 30 years, the change now is that the money and the capital is being driven in that direction. And I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding in the financial services sector about what this agenda really means. So I think there's a massive opportunity there for well-informed GCs to help their boards understand it. And the other thing I found about environmental, certainly in all the years I've been doing it, is people either discount it as totally unimportant, or it becomes disproportionately important. There's a weird sort of dystopian distortion. And the reality is it's a commercial issue like any other. It's a very important imperative for mankind and for business. But it's a commercial issue that can and should be dealt with. But like anything else, you need understanding. You need to have the right people in the right place and the right governance structures. So my urging to GCs would be react to this, but don't overreact to this. This is another issue that's been added to your responsibility list, but with the right advice and the right information and the right governance structures, it's a commercial risk that you can help your boards steer and understand and navigate around. And that, from what I'm seeing from boards, most CEOs want to be the ones to say, you know, we're best in class with sustainability and ESG. So you're pushing at an open door. Mark, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree, Caroline. The only thing I might add is I think there's a sort of a balancing role in a way. And maybe I'm summarising some of what you just said for the GC role to play in terms of, yeah, as you say, the CEO agenda and I think the brand agenda around ESG, which has changed dramatically, as you say, in the last couple of years, where organisations are seeing it as a brand enhancing opportunity. Versus protecting the organisation against what it is saying publicly, and we might come on to it later, but around the potential for future claims. So I think the worst thing that organisations can be doing now is making claims that they can't support, and I think the GC has a role to balance, as I said, the opportunity that exists around ESG and protecting the organisation against making statements that it can't support at this moment in time.
Yeah, no, and interestingly, I was just going to jump back in there, Carolyn, to your point. I mean, I think being at COP last year in Glasgow, you definitely saw that shift, right? You saw the finance world stepping into the conversation in a way that I don't think it really has before, and really following the money is essential. So I think definitely, particularly with things like the senior manager regime, where in the UK now regulated banks have to have a senior person who responds and is responsible for their comments around their readiness to and their exposure to climate change, which probably ties in also with what Mark's saying, being able to know what you're saying and back it up, and then to really be resilient on what you're doing around it, because that's the real fundamental. The fundamental is the action. And you need to be honest about what you're doing, and you need to take action, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think the audit trail and the governance structures are critical in this, as they are in lots of other areas for GCs. So I think it's just an expansion of those sort of areas and ideas. But the money, the capital can drive outcomes, and that's what the government has woken up to rather late in the day, or all governments have, is that you've got to put the money behind the outcomes if you want to drive change. And so that's really where corporate reporting and ESG is coming into its own, particularly in things like energy transition, which is going to have the biggest impact, the biggest bang for your buck, if you like. So as for lawyers, there are risks and opportunities here. So lots of opportunities for corporates and for GCs to advise their companies and really show that they can increase the bottom line in this area. It isn't all about risk. Some of it's about opportunity and profit as well.
Fantastic. Alistair, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it's all been covered. Happy to move on to next.
Fantastic. So this is another open question to everyone on the panel. So how does the panel think the landscape for legal advice on climate change and the profile of the profession will be changed by 2025? Mark, should we start with you?
Thanks, Bal. I'm immediately coming to the non-lawyer on the panel for the first comment on that one, but I'll have a go, and then I'll hand to my learned colleagues. I think there's a few areas, and I think they've been mentioned already. I think a big change will be around claims, potential claims coming from greenwashing. I think we've seen some of this already in more in the social side. So, for example, investigations or inquiries into things like supplier mistreatment or misconduct, child labour in the supply chain. Obviously, the Modern Slavery Act's been out for a while, and statements have been in the public domain for a while. But I think more on the sort of green claims and litigation side, I think we will see greater both litigation and enforcement coming through, and that will require greater advice, and obviously bringing more of the litigators into this space. I think we talked about green finance and investing. It's already a significant area of most legal practices, but I see that as growing exponentially. I think as you say, following the money is absolutely vital, and so I do see a lot more advice needed in that space in the coming years. And then probably the last one is around reporting. So I think at last count we picked out something like 35 different reporting authorities globally around ESG, and that's going to grow. So the complexity of reporting and advice that organizations need on that is another area. So there's my first three for starters. I don't know whether Caroline or
sure.
come in next on that.
I would agree with all of that, Mark. I think data and data gathering is hopefully going to get simpler. I think in your piece you talked about some of the tools that are available. Data gathering is a huge pain for every organization, however large or small it may be. And I think that the mechanization of that, the digitization of data and procurement, is going to be a major development, and hopefully that will assist big and small practices. I think accountability, you've talked about litigation and greenwashing. I think that law firms will be in that in the eye of that storm as large corporates at the top end, but also as smaller advisors in local communities. There's going to be a greater growth in looking at what professional services do in their local communities and the differences between what they say and what they do. So I think there's going to be a greater demand for transparency and accountability. And with that will come the growth in the language that we use for corporate reporting. The taxonomies that are currently being developed, which I've seen us struggle with for the past 30 years. The new Sustainability Standards Reporting Board set up in Frankfurt is going to be looking at sustainability reporting standards and use of terminology. And I think that's going to be a massive growth area in the next 5 years, so that when people are reporting, we can, compare apples with apples using understood market terminologies. The market is still settling in the way that when the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 first came out and people experimented with green lease wording or contaminated land wording, and the Law Society moved in with its green card for contaminated land to help. I think we're pretty much at that evolutionary stage, and I think there will be room for professional guidance and for marketplaces to establish market norms and market wordings in M&A transactions, in disclosure reporting. So I think there's going to be a massive growth area in that. I think the development of conditional fee funding for larger toxic torts and for community accountability. We've seen cases of air pollution, for example, brought by local community groups and claimant law firms and campaigning law firms like Client Earth, holding larger corporates and holding public and governmental bodies, local authorities to account. So potential growth in public law and judicial review. And then finally, I think what is going to develop, and I'm very pleased to say this after 30 years of labouring away in a very small specialist field, is that I think it's going to become mainstream. The amount of young lawyers who want to get into this area, I'm seeing growing exponentially. And I heard the announcement earlier this week about adding climate change as a GCSE subject, which I think is fantastic and going to really help with green skills and green jobs, which the government I know is looking at. So I think there's a whole growth area in education and in the development of specialists, more and more specialist lawyers in this area, in different areas of it across the profession. So to be positive, lots of opportunity, I think, and lots of room for people to get involved in whatever capacity they're currently operating and really take part in moving this forward. It's exciting.
Yeah, so I've got the last slot on that one. So yeah, I mean, you think about that, 2025. That's 3 years from now, really. And if you think to yourself, where was I standing 3 years ago, right? And what conversations were we having then about this topic? This topic, you know, Caroline aside has been having this conversation for 30 years. The vast majority of people were not having this topic on their radar the way it is now. So when I look out, what does this look like in 2025? Certainly, I think it does get mainstreamed. It gets integrated across all industries, across all types of practices, whether I'm an employment lawyer and I'm looking at somebody's KPIs, or I'm an M&A lawyer, or I'm a finance lawyer, or I'm an environmental lawyer. All of those people will have an aspect of ESG in their considerations of how they are advising their clients. And when you're in-house, it will be part of your daily life, whether it's dealing with your reporting, which, Mark does a good job, cannot understate the difficulty of actually getting to good data and the time that it takes to do that for companies. Or whether it's going to be, are we going to buy this asset because 7 years from now we won't be able to finance it? I mean, if you think about what transformation has to happen for people to meet net zero goals that they've announced in 2030, 2025 is halfway there. And if you're listening and you're paying attention, you should be front-ending that work, not back-ending that to 2030. It needs to be front-ended to now. And so I think in 2025, this is going to be on every lawyer's plate as an ongoing topic. And so to the extent that people can upskill themselves now, become aware of where this intersects with what they're doing, that's where I would advise people to go next. Pick up whatever industry document you like and that you find reputable. Go to the NZLA, the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance. We're a member of that, together with a lot of people. Go to TCLP, which has done a fantastic amount of work. We're also part of that, as is lots and lots of other people. I can't understate TCLP. That's not like contract bits that people have just kind of put out there. Those have been reviewed through 3 levels of scrutiny. It is proper drafting that goes into the TCLB contract clauses, and they're available and free to use. So go and engage on the subject now. It would be where I hope people are going, so that in 2025, this is something that people are across.
Fantastic, Emery. I'll leave the final comments of Alistair over to you.
Yeah, just some brief comments on rounding up some of these really interesting thoughts in the discussion. I think the international task force that Antonio Guterres is putting together at the United Nations to come up with an international definition on exactly what net zero is a really, really interesting area. And it feeds back into Mark's point about, litigation claims on greenwashing. We're going to see more scrutiny as to what exactly net zero looks like and means, and by consequence, we may see more litigation there. The Biodiversity Convention, which has regrettably been pushed back a number of times, I think is another really interesting area as the sustainability and biodiversity agenda right now it kind of takes a siloed approach. I think as it starts to be bundled up more with the climate change agenda, we're going to see some really interesting stuff there, namely the task force for biodiversity disclosures. If anybody knows the TFCD requirements, there's possibly going to be ones on biodiversity and environmental performance as well, and disclosures. That's another going to be a really interesting and key area for solicitors to look at. And then lastly as well, you've got scope X discussion, lawyered emissions and these sort of things. We're seeing Clifford Chance implement their, onboarding client policy and how they incorporate climate change risk into their thinking there. I think that's another key one that firms are going to be more gradually looking at as this agenda progresses. So yeah, it's extremely fast moving, and I think the discussion today really quite sums up the plethora of issues that solicitors and society have to grapple in all of this. And it will be interesting to see where we are in 2025.
Fantastic, Alistair. Really appreciate everyone joining the panel discussion. That will come, there'll be an end to the event today. Again, thank you so much to Mark, Alistair, Anne-Marie, Caroline, and also Andrew for allowing me to co-moderate today's session. Really appreciate that. No, honestly, thank you so much. For all our attendees on the call, there's an opportunity to provide some feedback, what you liked about the event, will potentially improve on next time, and most importantly, what you would like to see from the Eagle Labs in terms of events, any topics that you want to recommend to us to actually talk about. We'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you to everyone on our panel. Really appreciate everyone's time. I found it hugely value adding, and I'm sure our attendees did as well. Have a good day, everyone, and enjoy the sunshine. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.